recently in a meta-analysis that is looking at as much data as could be gathered about the Anglo contact with the New World. And it was estimated that 56 million by the 1600s were exterminated, mostly by disease, but also by conflict. And that amounts to about 90% of the pre-Columbian indigenous population, equivalent to about 10% of the world global population at that time. So this makes it one of the great dying episodes in human history, which is a sad commentary. And I also want to mention that, ironically, many who came to the United States came because of religious persecution. And yet, when they got here, they turned around and persecuted the natives by outlawing their religion. Things happened pretty slowly on the East Coast, and a lot of relocation occurred. It was much faster through the West, just because of armed conflict, and then very, very quick in California, which I'll talk about next time. It's estimated that the 21 missions over their 100 years, less than 100-year stint, 37,000 people died on the missions. I think there's something like 3,000 buried in the cemetery at San Juan Bautista. Someone asked me about the relocations. These are all the tribes right after 1830, when the Relocation Act, and then tribes from 1860 to 1892. And this means that many people were thrown together in different areas without their traditional connection to certain land and certain sacred spots. And of course, there was a Dawson Act that allowed Anglos to settle and buy Indian property. It is difficult to talk about people who have largely vanished. When I was living on Fort Washakie Reservation, they used to like to say that no one can see them because they are the invisible Americans. And in many ways, they still feel that way. So much was done to outlawing religious practices, also subsidizing Christian missionary efforts, actually giving them money to make the trips and do conversions and so on. And then this almost 100 years of relocation. Relocation also included assimilation, which was the great government buzzword, sending kids to big schools. This was Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania, teaching them English and making them speak only their English, cutting their hair, of course, putting them in Western garb, and teaching them industrial skills. It took a long time before things took a swing. These are some of the most important acts. I'll talk a little bit about some of these. The most important one will be, in our regards, is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, 1978. Not until then were they allowed to practice their traditional beliefs, and it also established the Native American Church. This act is very, very important because almost all the archaeological remains and artifacts are in federal museums, especially the Smithsonian, and this allows for skeletal remains and other artifacts to be returned and repatriated. I'm going to be talking about this section. This is enormous. It covers from the plains to the high mountains to the desert southwest, a great vast area with lots of different peoples and lots of different beliefs, but many of them still animistic, but in places reaching sort of megalopolis structures that we saw in the Mississippi Valley. I want to give you another concept, and this is known as It's an Inupiaq concept called Inu or Inia, and it recognizes that every spirit um, of rocks, of plants, and animals is recognizable and can be felt. And so when they carve, the Inupiaqs carve, they will show the spirit, the Inua, within. And also when they hunt, they will respect the animal spirit by making beautiful little pieces of harpoon points or net floats or other things to show them their reverence for the animal spirit. And the thought is if they show good reverence, uh, then the animal will be kind of taken by the beauty of this object and willingly give itself. And then, of course, if they get a seal or a whale, all the bones and other things are returned to the ocean so they can reassemble their spirit. I'm going to be doing these kind of headlines just to tell you what I'm talking about and also to show you where some of these places are. The West is a big area. People in the West tend to travel more, so maybe you will someday get to the Bighorn Mountains. You can't drive all the time up to this point. You drive almost 9,000 feet up to the top of Bighorn, and there on the very top is one of the most remarkable structures. It's just a circle made out of stone. It is the Great Bighorn Medicine Wheel. It is a registered landmark UNESCO site. The dates vary on this. There are some evidence that it goes back 3,000 years, but when you look at the wood that has been used, say, for the central post or something like that, it's only about 400 or 500 years old, but it is a very important spot. You might notice a big radar tower in the back. That's very typical of the government. It is a moving place, and it has long been used by many, many of the North Plains Indians, both as a vision quest site, and that's one of the thoughts that this is a shelter for vision quest, but also as a healing site. And it is also functions as a very good astronomical site. So if you go from the shelter point and draw a line, it actually gives you where the summer solstice rises. And it also shows you different phases of the moon. So it is a very elaborate and fairly accurate astronomical site and gives people a time for ceremonies. It wasn't crucial for planting, not in the Plains Indians so much, but ceremonies. When do you hold ceremonies? Which is where calendars in general came from. The medicine wheel, they are different according to certain tribes, and there's a lot of confusion, an awful lot written about them. Most of it is sort of pop psychology, and every place has a different setting and a different meaning. It's interesting to look at the Tibetan and the Buddhist traditions of a mandala or a thangka, which are used to focus meditation. And you can just concentrate so much so that you kind of dissolve into the diagram. And that's one of the underlying things about the medicine wheel. And medicine wheels are mostly in the West, but they're upper plains. This is the upper plains of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also down into the Southwest a little bit. And they take many forms. Many of them that survive have been shown to be partial astronomical, at least in the past they worked. And I mentioned Alberta, Saskatchewan. Many of these have been plowed under or they haven't been refurbished. The medicine wheel in Wyoming has been refurbished and is constantly being used and is also closed for various ceremonies. This is sometimes miscalled Canada's Stonehenge. It's very much in disrepair, and it wasn't. It was no more accurate than the Wyoming one, but I think it's misleading to call it Stonehenge. It's more like Pebble Mound or something. This is in Valley City in North Dakota. It's interesting because this is an old. These mounds are burial mounds, but this is used by the local tribes and also by other people. And medicine wheels along with mazes. And the idea of a maze is the same thing. You concentrate on the movement, and so you let your mind meld with the movement and other things. So these are Sedona's imitations. But even in Alberta, there are medicine wheels carved in some of the rocks. This is a interesting place. You see these hoodoos. This is called Writing on the Stone Provincial Park, but a number of different medicine wheels shown there. I am an academician, but I sometimes laugh at how things are communicated. This is a study in about what medicine wheels and sun circles could be. They compared them, the Bighorn, to various ones and said, these probably work as omphalos or earth navels or rotational places, sort of where the tree of life would be anchored. And they show this is largely non-contradictory and consistent with the uses and symbolic association of world centers. Thank you for your English. Omphalos is an ancient term, but many cultures believe that wherever they are the center of the world and the world revolves around them. This is an Easter Island. This is a monument you almost never see portrayed, but this is called the Naval of the Pacific because if you live on Easter Island, the world revolves around you. Other omphalos from the Greek and ancient world are very common. The medicine wheel also duplicates the floor plan, if you will. There are usually 28 spokes, which are usually the number of days in a month, according to lunar calendar. So the way the medicine wheel is used as a dancing area and also as a sacrifice area probably is replicated in the medicine wheel. And this is the pattern of a typical sun dance that is reflected in the medicine wheel. Someone who has undergone this, they are proud of their scars that have pulled out of their skin doing the ceremonial dance, and so they advertise that fact. I want to re-emphasize Hozo, which is the Navajo way of life, but it's actually the Native American way of life. That is, think if you were responsible by the way you lived for the sun to come up and for the moon to come up. Not that you had that power, but by your correct living, by your practicing of the right rituals, and by your respect that you show the world, these things will continue to happen. And that's one of the best description I can give you of a Native American belief, and that is what is often called walking in beauty. And of course, the walk through the medicine wheel is a walk through in beauty. So you get yourself to that state of mind. If you want to know what it's the opposite is like, if you have never seen the movie Kokoyankaksky, it is a good one to try to find. You'll have to look up the spelling. It's Godfrey Reggio, and it's an amazing movie and soundtrack by Phil Glass. And it means when things fall apart. And so this is the opposite for living in peace and harmony. So we were in Wyoming, so let's continue Wyoming. Of course, Yellowstone was very, very important, if not just for the hot baths, but also the concentration of wildlife, the soil that could be used for, that was rich in iron oxide, can be used for ochre decorations. So obviously some places like this were respected and used. Other places you may not know well, the Wind River Range. This is where I spent my first honeymoon, along with a contingent of about 30 Arapaho and Shoshone, all riding on horseback up into the mountains. And this is where I was shown for the first time these remarkable petroglyphs. This was in the 60s, and so I was wide open to strange things, let's say, and I had never seen these things before. And this is also a place where I met my first wife. She was an anthropology student studying the Shoshones, and she saw me at a tribal dance and cornered me in the hot springs. Thermopolis is it's both a tribal but also a city hot springs, remarkable geologic features, and also algae buildup and travertine buildup. But still, the Indians have, the Arapaho and Shoshone have a little section of this that they use for their own purposes. Now we're going to go to Montana, and this is Deer Medicine Rocks, a kind of sandstone outcropping on this little meadow with some interesting weathering. This is called Tefoni, the little kind of niches, but this is a place where Crazy Horse actually did his vision and also got his name from. And of course, one of the great monuments, sacred monuments, it has a kind of quaint story, and it is remarkable no matter how far you are from it. It just holds your eye from a distance. This is, of course, in eastern Wyoming. And this sign is rather indicative of one of the conflicts. This was originally tribal lands, now national park land, but the Indians have petitioned to have rock climbers not go up there at certain times. In fact, they tried to outlaw it, but the Park Service makes all kinds of concessions. The story is that once a bear was chasing these little girls. A mountain came up and took the girls up on top, and the bear tried to climb up. Then the girls were whisked off into the sky and became the Pleiades, which is remarkable. The story of the seven sisters, the Pleiades, is found in Japan and in Greece. I wonder sometimes if the Shoshone version may have been influenced by early Anglos, but the story still survives. And traditionally, people will come and do blessings and leave prayer flags and prayer bundles on the trees and so on. Not as dramatic. In fact, the tree is no longer there on the East Fork of the Bitterroot River, but this was long known as Medicine Tree, and people would come and just have fellowship and parties there. Eventually the tree fell over. They still come even though it's just a stump, and recognized that it was sort of a stand-in for all the sacred trees. It's just a ponderosa, but a very meaningful one. On the Missouri River is a giant springs, and it is right next to the river. So this is the Missouri, but this is an incredible spring, comes right out. It's an artesian that is strange because it comes out into a section of the river, has a different pH, different clarity and temperature. It's much colder than the river next to it. Lewis and Clark stopped here and commented how natives came here for fishing, but also just for drinking water. The Cave of the Elders is sort of a spooky place. When you look back into it, you see these concretions, and they look like heads just waiting there. And then rocks drip. The drips along the cliff line look like bundles of shaman. There are a lot of petroglyphs at the Cave of the Elders, some of them very Sundance-like, some of them very intricately painted. These are actually painted rather than pecked. Sweetgrass hills, it's important because I mentioned sweetgrass as an offering and as a prayer item throughout most of the Plains Indians and also into the Southwest. It doesn't occur in California normally, so most people here haven't heard of it. But this is one of the places that prairie people would go to collect massive bundles of sweetgrass to use as offerings and so on. This is Ne Percé in Idaho. This is actually along the Snake River. There are similar things along the Columbia River where it joins. We used to say this is the old boatman because he's got his paddle there, but this is a beautiful area below the Palouse Prairie, and it is a park and a visitor center that talks about the Nez Percé and Chief Joseph as he fled. But this has long been a sacred area, and it was an area where the Appaloosa was developed by the Nez Percé after the Spanish brought the horse. Nez Percé is up here. This is the Bitterroot, and I'm going to be talking about the craters of the moon, which have long been used as a site for obsidian and traded extensively and taken back across the prairie to be traded. Obsidian was extremely valuable for making spears and arrowheads, but the sources were very, very limited. Even in California, the sources were limited, and so there was a great deal of trading across the Sierra Nevada from the Mono Basin and elsewhere, but there still is a Mono Pass, which was used by the Paiutes to bring obsidian across. That's almost exactly where Highway 120 is today. But Craters of the Moon is also a very vivid, beautiful place for meditation, vision quest, as well as collecting obsidian. Geysers and hot springs have always been very, very crucial just because it shows the spirit of the earth itself coming forth in a very unexplainable way. I won't talk about this. I won't even mention where it is. I'll just say it's in Idaho. I feel guilty having taken many people up there, and now it's just overwhelmed with people. I feel sorry. I've done that to so many places, and I've seen the impact. We forget that there's some really important landmarks on the Great Plains. Here's Chimney Rock and Scots Bluff, which were seen from a great distance, and they were carved, but it's a very soft eroding sandstone and mudstone, so you don't see much in terms of petroglyphs or carvings, but you see more historical carvings on them. But undoubtedly, because these were so prominent in the area, they were very important to the Plains Indians. This is the Great Divide. You can actually walk on the Great Divide in many places, and these were important sacred spots that young men would go up and young women would go up, especially in the summer, for hunting, but also vision quests. They're very dramatic. And this is one of the few places, this hole, which you can barely get your head in, is the place where Lakota Sioux came out of the third world into the fourth world. That this is the emergence. I'll show you another place that is almost as small in the sense that all of the people came out of this. This, of course, leads to a massive underground cave complex. This roars often because the atmospheric pressure inside the cave is much different than outside. So there'll be a roar going in and out of this cave. Near Wind Cave is Bear Butte, a very dramatic spot that is also an emergence place for Sioux of different tribes. You see it's covered with prayer bundles and so on. Don't desecrate Bear Butte. This is what happens just a few miles from Bear Butte. You can see it in the background. And this is a little town called Sturgis. And of course, this just happened. And of course, an enormous flare up in COVID after the Sturgis ride in. Bear Butte is an emergent spot, and because of that is highly sacred and is used quite often. The state controls it, and they do try to limit hiking and also access during religious times. Other peaks, and Harney Peak in South Dakota, which is a part of the rite of passage that young men would walk along the ridge. It's a long, solid stone ridge to get up there. There's now a Forest Service observatory built by the CCC. And of course, Black Hills. I love this. If you look a little in the distance, you will see some very famous old white dead men. Black Hills has long been sacred. It's a very important area. It's next to the Badlands, by the way, which is also a very sacred spot. It's interesting, I'll mention this again, that during the Battle of, when Custer's last stand and when he was killed, there were two East Coast paleontologists digging in the Badlands. They left them completely alone because they knew they were crazy. Who else would be digging for giant bones? River confluences have long been very important, both as religious sites, but also social sites and meeting sites. And I've kayaked and paddled a lot of rivers, and I love the Platte. I had a girlfriend who kayaked the entire Missouri, and then to add to that, did the entire Mississippi. But anyway, the confluence, there is the Platte and the Missouri, very, very important. And Native peoples would come also for the hunting. This is still a very important migratory path and breeding area for sandhill cranes. Other places in Nebraska, well, there's Chimney Rocks along the Platte River, which and Scots Bluff. That was actually a difficult place for the wagons to get through, but it was a place to kind of aim for. This is not well known. The stories are legend about it. And just recently, someone took a drone and used LiDAR to show underground structures all over the place. You can sort of make out one there. But this was an old city complex, perhaps with temples, not really mound cultures of the Mississippian age or quality, but the city probably held 20,000 inhabitants, many of them in these kind of grass huts. But this place has been initially mapped now, and they're going to go back and once they get permission to do some of the archaeological work on it. There are a number of little fossil beds all over the US, and they're well known. John Day up in Oregon, for instance. This is agate fossil beds in Nebraska. I'll let you try to figure out what this is. If you have any guess, I'll tell you if you're right or wrong. But the Indians would come here, and the rocks would just stick out of the cliffs, or the bones, and you could get teeth, fossil teeth. These were all Pliocene fossil mammals, mostly. Giant things, including giant birds, but wolves, bears, elephants, and so on. So people would come and collect these teeth to use as magic amulets or as medicine. And Red Cloud came here quite often. Oklahoma, of of course, area that was sort of depopulated. It has actually part of the Mounds culture in a place called Spiro in eastern Oklahoma. But there's some beautiful mesas, sandstone mesas, not lava, with waterfalls and lots of petroglyphs that show they use this area because of the reliable water supply. Then we go to Colorado, and Colorado also is Rocky Mountains and then big plains. And of course, there's another fossil bed on the plains, and then some of the highest concentrations of archaeological sites, including Mesa Verde, which is the largest archaeological site in the United States. But if you haven't been south of Denver, here's the Garden of the Gods, these amazing sandstone hogbacks, which were lifted up by the Rockies. They're very inviting. Kids love them. There are some petroglyphs, but this is a real, and there are evidence of habitation by native peoples. Near this is paint mines, and this is a gorgeous area because all of these minerals could be extracted, mixed with buffalo fat or eggs, and made into paint, which was highly valued both for personal decoration and also for paintings, rock paintings in terms of pictographs. Great sand dunes. We know from habitation that it has long been a site for visiting and perhaps even hunting, but vision quests and petroglyphs around it. And then, of course, we come to the really amazing Mesa Verde, the green table, with its incredible cliff houses that are quite remarkable, but there's also very high concentrations of petroglyphs. When you see petroglyphs, it means that this spot meant something, that it communicated something to the people who lived there, and also they were communicating more with the spirits of the place. This is sort of like a membrane, as a medicine man friend said. Well, it's like a mirror. You look in and the spirits can look out. And there are many spirits in here, not just the spirits of rocks, but the spirit of animals in the past. So this is sort of a membrane. And if you want, you could put your hands in there, concentrate, and actually dissolve into the rock. And it is a really important religious center because these are all kivas, an enormous number of, and these would be roofed over, and each probably represented, and you see some more up here, these are the houses, the living structure, the storage structures, but these are the kivas, the ceremonial sites. And these were owned and operated, if you will, by certain societies that took animal guardian spirits as a means of membership. So all the badgers would get here, and they had their own obligations for honoring the badger. The antelope might be here, and even things like the lizard clan or the single horn clan or the double horn clan. And they would meet, they would do offerings, they would do wanderings and give offerings out in the desert and so on. So this is inside of one of the kivas. This would be roofed, there'd be a little hole and so on. These double horned, people have always wondered about them, but these are actually the two horn society. And there's also a one horn society. And this is a two horn society. I'll show you this guy later because he's associated with corn and he's associated with this. And look at this little mark there. I'll show you this later. Interesting, and what fascinates us about Mesa Verde and about other places is that with highly concentrated, very productive, very organized ceremonial and civic center, and yet the people vanished. They vanished about the 1300s. They basically disappeared. So it also is interesting to study how far back it goes, at least 2,500 years, where the first pit houses and then villages forming, and then sometimes moving underneath the top and into the cliff faces. And then they stayed there until about the 1200s. And by 1300, Mesa Verde was largely empty, except maybe for some wandering Fremonts or Navajo even. Why did they disappear in the 1200s? Well, this is a map of temperature change. So you could see an enormous drought occurring, 1282 and so on, again, 84, and so on. And these are areas that showed tremendous drought at different times. They probably survived some of the earlier ones, but the big one that hit in the 1200s probably wiped out the crops, the soil, and also it's estimated that in the 1200s, some of the rivers stopped flowing. So at this point, they had to go somewhere. So it's estimated maybe 10 to 30,000 Pueblos migrated to New Mexico and down to Mexico. There, they kind of changed their culture, changed their language. And so we don't really know what happened to the Pueblans or their traditions. Another story that will repeat itself, but obviously a very important sacred spot with all these. This was long been called a reservoir. It's on the top of the green table for Mesa Verde, but it doesn't collect water very well. You need a good runoff surface to collect water, so you would better off having a reservoir at the bottom where you could collect water. This has been reanalyzed, and it's now thought to be a very large ceremonial complex, probably not for ball playing, which is very common in the Southwest, but probably for dancing, which is also very, very important. One interesting recent study, I don't have much of a life. I read all these weird reports, but one thing that says that the Pueblans went to New Mexico and the northern Rio Grande is the turkey bones that they find in New Mexico are identical to the turkey DNA that they find in Mesa Verde. That suggests they took the turkeys with them. Also, both Mesa Verde had an area where they looks like they ceremoniously sacrificed coyotes and buried them. They also had dogs, but these were distinctly coyotes. And then the same thing happens in the northern Rio Grande area and the Santa Fe of New Mexico. So turkeys and the same practices do show up after these people move. This is called the Sun Temple. It's on the top. Most people don't go to it. It's very beautifully arranged. And in fact, it's so carefully arranged that it actually shows a golden mean, isosceles triangle, and it shows basically advanced geometry that we generally don't associate with indigenous populations. Inside this structure too is this little alcove, which is puzzle. It obviously held water, but it had these grooves, and it is thought that these grooves may have acted as a sundial. This is the Mummy Lake I was just talking about. This is one of the shrines, and then this is the Coyote Village, the area where coyotes were buried. And coyotes are very powerful, sometimes playful, sometimes trickster figures in most of the Southwest they are godlike, but also very undependable. So what they were doing, burying them in these mysterious rituals, is a puzzle. Likewise, these are dogs that were buried extensively, and no one knows quite why. They were buried often in the kiva floor, which is interesting. A number of different sites that most people don't get to around this. And Mesa Verde is right here, but this is also in the middle of what would later become the Navajo people. And the Navajos have 4 sacred mountains. When the Navajo emerged, the Creator made these 4 sacred places to be their ancestral home. Ironically, they are distributed in 3 states. And of course, they have long since lost control of these places. These are now mostly Forest Service lands, although they have begun to buy some land back, particularly in Colorado. And these mountains are also sort of the navel. They represent the Navajo universe, and the hogan, which is a traditional structure, will face east, so they align with the mountains. Sadly, San Francisco Peak was the ski resort run by the Forest Service, expanded, and they wanted to make more snow artificially, so they were going to use basically untreated sewage water to make snow. The Navajo people protested, but they lost the battle. There are many houses that are villages in Mesa Verde that aren't visited, and many of these are multiple stories. Some of these you have to climb up the cliff face, which has steps dug into it. And this is the great tower complex at a place called Mitchell Springs, which is actually part of a new monument adjacent to Mesa Verde. And it is one of the biggest single structures in North America. It's in prehistoric, pre-Columbian North America. And it's all stonework, very carefully done. And then this was a multiple story kiva that was undoubtedly open to the top. There's a couple of other kivas in this. This is undergoing excavation right now in a place called Yellowjacket Canyon. In this area, especially around Cortez, there are a number of museums. People ask me about places to visit. If you go to Mesa Verde, there's the Anasazi Historical Center, the Cortez Cultural Center, and the Canyons of the Ancients, which is where Mitchell Springs is located. Most of these are operating on limited basis right now. Sometimes you could go to the tribal park, the Ute Tribal Park, and they will conduct tours to a couple of habitations and petroglyphs that take a bit of scrambling to get to. But this is run by the tribal office, and it is something you should keep in mind because you get to see places with a native interpreter. This is the Anasazi site and museum. And what's interesting is that there is an adjacent site along with it. Utah, which is gifted with remarkable desert areas and probably one of the highest concentrations of national parks and so on in the United States. I might start with one that's just across the way from Cortez, and this is Colorado, and there's Cortez. This is Mesa Verde. Anasazi is right here, but this is Hovenweep. You have to take some back roads to get to it. And this area is now also a national monument. But Hovenweep may have been a protective area for Mesa Verde. It was formed along a series of barrancas or arroyos, and they were tall towers, and they seemed to be warning system. You could light a fire in one, see it in the next one, and so on, all the way up and down the canyon. And then a runner might go to Mesa Verde, at least that's one of the theories, and warn them that another tribe was coming. 9 Mile Canyon, which is in the center part of Utah. It's a canyon that basically goes nowhere, but it is definitely worth taking. It's a beautiful little creek. It's south of a town called Price. It's in Carbon County, so the very dead center almost of Utah. But what 9 Mile is famous for, it has one of the highest concentrations of petroglyphs. This is the road down there, and this is Price, and this is the road goes up and basically stops. There's another branch that goes up here, and eventually you could get to I-70, but you're free to just climb up and be amazed by these things. These are very likely members of perhaps the two-horn group that are involved in placating and calling forth the bighorn sheep. This may be a one-horn member, or there's another two-horn member, but these are calling both elk, that's an elk, another elk, and then bighorn sheep. It may be that this is magic to bring these animals down. They would come down out of the highlands because of the water, but you can see how many petroglyph panels there are along this 9 Mile Canyon. There is another area near here that was an old ranch, and it had one of the highest concentrations of habitations that were not ever examined. The rancher donated it to the University of Utah, and it's being excavated at the moment. This is also parts of 9 Mile. You can see the road just below it, a beautiful creek that's running through. These are different dates, and also a couple of them are painted. So these are probably earlier Fremont, and these are much later, perhaps the Mesa Verde types. And then, of course, speaking of Utah, this is on the license plate. You'll never see it like this unless you get up at 3 a.m. in the morning and hike up there. This is Delicate Arch and Arches, the Henry Mountains in the background. And if you were there last month with me at sunrise, this is what it looks like. In fact, all day long, people streaming up and down. You know, it's funny, Utah was protesting the Bears Ears National Park, yet here is a national park being loved to death, as every national park is, especially at the moment. This did not let up during that particular day, just a month ago. There are some hidden places. These actually are part of Canyonlands, and this is one of the most profound panels, and this gives the name to this particular type of painting. This is called the barrier pattern, and as a friend of mine explained, if you've taken something like datura or even peyote or some other hallucinogen, you don't want to be wandering around the canyons at night or the cliffs. So often what the shaman would have done is they would be wrapped up almost like an infant in swaddling clothes, so that they couldn't get up, and they would have the maximum experience of their out-of-body experience. Canyonlands is probably as dramatic as Grand Canyon, not as visited. This actually is, that's the Green River, but Canyonlands is largely unexplored, especially the needles component of it. And then a couple of southern Arizona petroglyph spots. I don't know how they got in. So go back to Utah. This is in Zion. In Zion, you had to have, actually, Zion was closed to vehicle entry. It still is, I think. You have to have a permit that you get in a complicated governmental fashion to ride the shuttle bus in and out. So that's what's coming. You probably have to get permits just to show up in the park in the future. This is Dripping Springs, a very, very important place that Native people would go to just because it's just a magical spot. And then the Virgin River, which has long been used as a kind of vision site. And then this is an area called the Subway, which is on the Upper Virgin. This is a place very few people know about. It's off of maybe 10 minutes off of I-15 as you're coming north from Cedar City and so on. You go out and here's this mountain range, and it is carved through by an old riverbed. And this acts as a gun site, and acts as a gun site for the sun. The summer solstice rises through that site. It also represents the beginning of the Great Basin, and you can see one of the mountains out here in the distance. That may be the Great Basin National Monument, but this is a long basin and then the mountains. So this spot is chock-a-block with petroglyphs and some very unusual ones. The sun, obviously, this may be sort of a calendar. This zipper thing may have something to do with the sun, and this as an observatory. You can see a group of people actually waiting for the sunrise, and they've been caught. So this is the sunrise going right through the gap. This is another site. Actually, this is in Colorado, sorry, but that's okay. I like this site because it shows some action, which is pretty unusual. Two bear cubs, and this is the mama bear, no doubt. Maybe they were chasing this elk and created problems, but nobody really knows what most of these actually mean. Lest we forget Texas, and it's a huge state that's part mountains, part prairie. And the Guadalupe Mountains long been sanctuary and also sacred spot for the Apache and also Comanche and Kiowa. It's now a national park. And one great thing that came out of the late 1890s when we began to see all this area in the West depicted by artists and early photography, we began to develop park systems, and Teddy Roosevelt established the National Wildlife System and others. Mountains in the desert are always going to be very, very important. This is Guadalupe again. This is Enchanted Rock, which is in the central part of Texas, which is, and you can see this, that happens to be a typical view right now. The park is very, very popular. It's just a big laccolith, a big granite outcropping with potholes and so on, but lots of petroglyphs as well. Nearby is the Seminole Canyon, which have a lot of pictographs, painted ones, which are very interesting with a little stream. You usually will find a stream near petroglyphs and pictographs. And again, this says it was a sacred spot to communicate, to get messages, and to maybe find balance with the world as it should be. Some remarkable painted ones. This is unusual because it has tricolor using copper, probably turquoise and ochre to get these images. They almost look like Vikings. This is Waco tanks. Tanks in the West are areas that will accumulate water. They're rocky areas at the bottom of a creek or just in between, and these will hold water for quite some time. And so these were very valuable when Indians were moving or hunting. They knew up here would be a water source. So in this case, it was quite valuable. It's now a state park. And again, some of these petroglyphs, which are very, very unusual, beautiful designs. with emphasis on eyes, and Seminole Canyon. And this is one of the Waco Canyon or Waco State Parks. Then Navajo National Monument is not well known, but it's worth it. It's in northern Arizona, very hard to get to for most people, but it's wonderful hiking and lots of little cliff dwellings here and there. This is Gila Bend, and it's an area that's along the Gila River. Gila River flows through Colorado and then goes into the Rio Grande. And it has long been a sacred spot. Of course, Gila River and the Rio Grande are was being fenced to keep unwanted out. So let's go to Arizona. Arizona, like Utah, is blessed with lots of national parks, but lots of national monuments. And most of these are dedicated to historical and geological features. Some of these features are recent and they don't really have historic uses by Navajo or Hopi. These are the Antelope Canyons that are now a big tourist site, but apparently not used and weren't discovered for a while. To me, one of the most interesting and sacred places are the three mesas, the three cities, the sky cities, sometimes just called first, second, and third mesa, or they have their own names. But these have been continuously occupied for probably 5,000 years. There are little foot trails going up on here. There are kivas up. This is basically the center of the Hopi Nation. And the Hopis are an interesting kind of peculiarity in that they represent a nation inside the United States that's surrounded by another nation, the Navajos, and then surrounded by the United States of America. So they're a landlocked nation. Here's first and second mesa. And these line up as the belt of Orion, and they match up with Rigel, Betelgeuse, and so on, and they become, they're symbolic of the stellar system and the stellar gods, whoever the god was. My friend used to say this was not Orion, but Alkaline, who was a baseball player and his hero. I don't know what hero this represents in Navajo or Hopi mythology. Hopis also worship ant-men, so it could be an ant. Canyon du Chet, which is a remarkable area in the eastern edge of Arizona. This is sometimes called Spider Rock, and this was the emergence spot for Spider Woman. And Spider Woman gave people food, but also taught them skills and also collected the sun for them. And it's interesting, one of the most powerful deities is a little tiny orb weaving spider. She wanted to get the sun for people to stay warm, so she made a little clay bucket, put it on her back, spun her threads, and went to the sun and just nipped a little bit of it and brought it back. Very beautiful. This is privately owned by the tribe. You'll have to have pay for admission. They'll take you in old army trucks, but you can get a permit to hike as well. And then the Monument Valley. This is part of the Navajo reservation, but they have a big section of area that they will take you around or let you drive on. That is called the Tribal Navajo Monument or Monument Valley. So it is different than the regular monument, national monument. So it says tribal park, so you have to pay. Right at the moment it's closed, but you can drive through it. And it is often part of postcard representation of the West, seen often in the old John Ford movies with John Wayne. And this is the true Monument Valley, which is actually in Utah, and the Valley of the Gods. they are separate. So here is Monument Valley down here. This is the Indian portion of it. This is Mount Humphrey, which is where the Kachinas come out. They come out about now, actually, more like December and January, and then even into February. And they begin to bring the rain, and then they do their dances. They each have a single dance that they do, or multiple times during a particular time slot or weekly event. Some very strange areas near Monument Valley with, I don't know, tall, perhaps cranes coming down. They do fly over this area. And this is Montezuma's castle and Montezuma's well. Wapatki, another isolated Pueblo area. This represents probably a ball field, not a kiva. And the closer we get to the border, the more Aztec influence there probably was, our Mayan influence. And so there are many, many ball fields that have sort of seating around them as well. This to me is one of the most amazing spots. This is, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened to my editing. It just seemed to have fallen apart. This is the Little Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, and here is the Colorado River. And right where they meet on the northern shore of the Little Colorado is this thermal spring. And it has a big hole that often bubbles, but often will just sink back down. And this is all travertine. And this is the emergence place for the Hopi and the Navajo, or primarily the Hopi. And this is the Sipapu, the original Sipapu. And it is a sacred area on the Colorado, or the Little Colorado. You may notice how this Little Colorado has this silt in it, and it makes it quite beautiful. It's a lovely thing to just float down here with your life jacket on and go by the Sipapu. Similar to that is the Havasu Falls, which is privately owned by the Havasupai, and gets the same kind of luscious turquoise blue. You have to have a permit to get into this, but it is one of the most exquisitely beautiful and tranquil places. This is the Salt River, the Gila River, and then the Gila River as it moves toward Yuma and flows into the Colorado River. This is a symbol for the river and probably a solar line. There's a proposal to make this little bend right here a national monument. And if you have any influence with our politicians, this really deserves to be included into national monument status. The river is one of the last places. It is a riparian flow that's unique. Plus it has a high concentration of petroglyphs. So if you ever see anything about the Gila Bend, it also has isolated hot springs, and it's hard to get in here. If it became a national monument, it would probably be developed to some degree, although our Fort Ord really hasn't been developed. Incredible landscape and petroglyphs in this area. Now, at last we come to New Mexico. In northern New Mexico is a small city complex called the Aztec Ruins, and a part of it's been reconstructed, including this massive kiva in the front. Now you notice there's lots of other little kivas, but this probably was a communal one for the whole group to meet and make political and other ceremonial decisions. It was very egalitarian. People would take their turns talking and make decisions about planting, political alliances, and also when to hold certain celebrations. Individual celebrations would be planned in these individual society kivas probably. It has been partially reconstructed, but there's a lot of outlying ruins that haven't been touched yet. So there's a lot still to be done. This is the giant kiva. it's quite interesting to be inside there. And then near this is the Gila Cliff dwellings, very precipitous, very high up and very well secured. Interesting, there is a whole monument devoted to petroglyphs because this is an old basaltic lava flow, and it is perfect because it gets this patina made actually by a crust of bacteria that pull magnesium out of the rock and coat it with this purple varnish in a way, sometimes called desert varnish. But if you peck on the rock, you will actually expose the softer color underneath. And it's interesting, what are these people seeing? That they have horned birds. Well, they might be horned birds. This one is obviously a macaw. So we know the macaws were traded all the way up Mexico into New Mexico, and they ended up with the elite in these small cities in Chaco Canyon and so on. And here's proof positive. The only thing bad about Petroglyphs National Monument is this is Albuquerque. And so you have to go through Albuquerque to get to this, and there's always some sort of construction going on. But if you're there, there are a lot of other things around, museums, archaeological sites, and so on. Bandelier, which is near Los Alamos, not often visited, but it was an interesting circular one that had kivas in the middle, and then these built up along the side with rooms dug out of the wall. This is sandstone and pumice. This is one of my favorite kivas in Bandelier, very isolated up one of the side canyons. And then at last we come to Chaco, one of the largest structures built pre-Columbian in North America, still a mystery. The big, beautiful Pueblo Bonita, started probably around 900, took at least another 100 years or 200 years to finish. So these are the different times they were added on. You see all the kivas. This was 3 stories tall. So this is just the ground floor. So add 2 more stories and you can get 600 rooms out of this particular structure, built between 800 and 1200, and then over 30 kivas. So this was obviously a ceremonial center and also administrative center. Very similar timeline, except maybe going back a little bit earlier. Pit houses around 200 AD, and then larger houses. Small houses, 700s, with some of these pueblos. And then the height of building and power was about 900 to 1200. After 1200, everything stops and migration starts. And it's thought maybe once the pueblos left, the Navajo came in and occupied it for a time, but then they dispersed too. So another great mystery. This stood empty for almost 200 years before it was basically discovered by Anglos. Some of the pueblos have very different kinds of structures and layouts that often will align with this canyon itself. There is a dirt road, but it's not that bad, 30 or 40 miles to get to this open camping, and lovely trails all over the place. And the kiva, here's the sipapu, built into the base of every kiva that represents where the Navajo and Hopi came from and merged from the world. There's fire pit event places for working and storing things. This, of course, would be roofed over and be logged, both with log bracings here and also on the top. The kivas would be for various societies. They would have various altars in them, depending on what time of the year it was. These would be shields, medicine shields, sacred shields that would be worn by the members of this particular group. on their back. And then here would be cornmeal or corn pollen, which was sacred. This is an altar from the Flute Society. And once they've done their blessings and talked, they would go out and give homage to the music, depending on what their society was. And they would hide these little carved items for the spirits to find and appreciate. So these little doll-like structures were actually left. Here is the two-horn clan. You see the two horns here, and this is a very interesting one, as I mentioned, that's standing by this diagram. There is a Kachina calendar that vaguely looks like the medicine wheel, and it talks about which particular Kachina comes out. So here's the January dance, where they're just social dancing, storytelling, creation stories, and then different sorts of things. For instance, the bean dance and the corn dance, snake and antelope, the flute ceremony. So all of this was carefully planned out. So the ceremony had to follow certain restrictions. So the snake and the antelope were honored, and the rains would come. Now in Chaco, just off out on the flat, is Bajada Butte. And some archaeologists were climbing up there and discovered a circular petroglyph. Then they saw these leaning slabs. This is a reconstruction. And at certain times of the year, the sun will rise, shine through this slab, or one of the slabs, and shine right on the middle of this maze. If it's summer solstice, it will be right through the middle. If it's the fall equinox, it's over here. The spring equinox is a little further. The winter solstice, because there's 3 rocks, there'll be 2. So this is an amazing astronomical marker that was obviously human modified and used to signify when these Kachina dances and secret society dances should be held. Sadly, the story I heard was some archaeologists were working up here, wanted to get a better picture or something, and had some pneumatic machinery, and they moved them, and the rocks shifted. So this kind of sun dagger at the summer solstice is not possible anymore. However, there are other indications around Chaco, petroglyphs that show what? This actually, because of carbon dating, looks like it represents the solar corona of either a lunar eclipse, a full eclipse, or an actual supernova. This one down here is more likely the supernova. This one's been dated to actually about 1050s, and there was a supernova at the time. So many other observations on things. Now, Chaco was connected to Aztec, but connected to all these other major great houses. That is, they were structures, multiple stories probably. So this was a huge cultural phenomenon all over the Southwest, and Chaco was the center of this. These are roads. They're actually paved roads, stone paved. They go right out of these grand houses, and they go off in the distance. Some of these have actually been extended by satellite in great distance. And we now know that these things were traded down to Mayan Empire. One last comment about this. The turquoise that was found extensively at Chaco and then later traded down to the Mayan Empire actually came from Nevada and partially from California. So we now have evidence. This was a burial, by the way, with abalone from California and this from the Sea of Cortez, and over 5,000 beads buried with a man in one of the houses. What it looked like, 3 stories high, lots of activity. Why did it disappear? Well, obviously the population grew, they managed irrigation, they had a lot of people growing plants. That probably necessitated a hierarchical control. Perhaps the religious system changed. They had to have wood, they deforested. There were millions of trees that were required to build this place. The soil fertility declined, people's dissatisfaction increased, and dispersal and immigration probably succeeded. So the same thing probably happened at Mesa Verde. Jared Diamond devotes a chapter to this in his book Collapse. I was reminded on my last trip, Chimayo, which is north of Taos, is an old spring, and it was a sacred site. And when the Padres came here, they usurped it and put a Christian chapel on top of it, a Catholic chapel on top of the sacred site. Still, every Easter, people come from miles and miles, trudging, carrying crosses up here, putting crosses on the fence around the sanctuary, leaving their milagros, their rosaries at the altar, and going in and getting holy dirt. These are all the, I had a milagro I left there for my knee, but it didn't, well, it worked for a while. But get out with your friends, visit some of these spots, and keep in touch.